Tim Yardley. You guys all sort of know me already. I'm not going to talk about myself. So I was asked to talk about ethical assessment. So I'm going to talk about ethical assessment as sort of an interlude and talk about security through examples in critical infrastructure. So we'll start by setting the stage, talking a little bit about what these systems are. Right? So when you look at adversaries, the people that are going to be potentially attacking systems, they're broken into several different sort of categories. The nation states, those are the entities that are, let's say, well-funded, well-skilled, and have some sort of, let's say, direct motive to do something. There's hackers. Hackers are likely not as well-funded, but maybe even more skilled in some cases, or less skilled depending on it, but don't necessarily have a particular motivation associated with their work, although they could. They could be work for hire, for instance. Terrorists, cyber terrorists, et cetera, they're, let's say, highly motivated by a particular thread, let's say. Their skills could be varied. They could be composed of any sort of other things. Cybercrime, organized crime, criminal elements, those are typically motivated by money. Competitors are motivated by IP. They typically want to take information. Disgruntled employees, well, they're disgruntled, so their motivation is to, cause harm back in some way in a lot of cases. And then let's say the normal human. And the normal human doesn't intend to necessarily to do something bad, but makes bad things happen, right? So what are the properties here in industrial control systems that we look to actually satisfy, and what are the goals of that, right? So at the top level, what industrial control systems, the standard operating sort of paradigm for them is that they need to keep the lights on, right? In the electric power grid, that's the utmost important job, is that we need to keep the lights on. But there's also more than that, right? So we need to protect the equipment and infrastructure for damage, because if we don't protect it from damage, then we can't keep the lights on, right? It's also, some equipment is very expensive or difficult to replace. So that factors into it too. So if something does break, it may take years or months or millions of dollars to replace it in the case that it's a critical component. We have to ensure safety. So safety is paramount in industrial control systems, even more so in oil and gas, but in electric, safety is a mantra, right? Keep people safe. Don't kill people. That's bad. People dying is bad, right? We also have to make money as a company. So the industrial control system entities, they are a business, right? And they have to stay a business, which means to make money. They also are generally interested in protecting their systems, let's say from a cybersecurity perspective, but that cybersecurity perspective, these slides, bullet points didn't indent appropriately, but the cybersecurity perspectives are NERC-CIP compliance sort of reasons, but other reasons too. So what do they protect under that? Well, they need to protect availability. They need to protect systems and data integrity. So being able to trust the information there. They need to be able to protect the data, the control commands, and the systems themselves, let's say host level or network level. They need to protect confidentiality, particularly of certain types of data. So market data, for instance, or market influencing data needs to be protected because that can be used to game the system. And then privacy, at least on the consumer side, is important. And that's primarily because people get mad when you leak information about them, right? What are some of the limitations and constraints that industrial control systems have, right? So one is time scale. Depending on what you're doing, you may have milliseconds, but you may have minutes, depending on what types of operations you're looking at. So for instance, protection messages generally have a 4 millisecond sort of window or operating constraint that you need to operate in. PMU data is a sample every 33 milliseconds that's going out. Things aren't necessarily relying on it on a 33 millisecond sort of realm, but that kind of gives you an idea of what some of the things are in there, right? You also have the application of existing IT security principles in this space. So when I say that, I mean enterprise IT isn't necessarily applicable in industrial control systems. Some is, some isn't, right? So how do I deploy ubiquitous virus scanning, for instance, on embedded systems? I can't. relays can't run a virus scanner, so nor does it necessarily make sense. So these generic practices that enterprise IT does don't necessarily apply, and we have constraints associated with the devices. There's also resource constraints themselves. So the devices that are under scope here have limited capability. When I say limited capability, it could be CPU memory, it could be bandwidth, it could be just the nature of the system itself, right? There's also legacy integration issues that are constraints, needing to maintain backwards compatibility because I have something that I can't replace, for instance. So I can't just overhaul and say put security in and that's great, or do patches and that's great. There's even 8-bit systems out there that are still running our electric grid. That's scary, but true. And then there's other things that just literally have no security features whatsoever. So ethical assessment. How do you go about assessing these industrial control systems, knowing these types of constraints that are there? So let's start with what is ethical assessment. So this is based on an approach called CEH, Certified Ethical Hacking. The certification method to teach people how to hack in a way that is professional. It's focusing on the skills rather than on let's say, the fun of it, which is what a lot of things that you'll see is. And so what I'm about to talk about is by no means complete training, but think of it as an overview of the type of process that you go through.
Tim?
Yep.
Since you're commenting about the 8-bit stuff, I'd like to know that I just hired IT people to install 16-bit version of Windows 7 or whatever, because it will run 8-bit program. And I have an 8-bit program that I can't rewrite.
Yeah.
But I want to run it, and it works beautifully on 16-bit. Sure. This goes back only, okay. That's a good example of your 8-bit.
Sure. Thank you, Pete. So let's use some terminology. So an asset, that's the thing that is physically manifested in some way. It's a computer, it's a relay, it's a PLC, etc. A network resource is a switch or a service, right? So it's something that's either providing networking to you or is responding to network-related requests. A threat is somebody who's out to get you in some way, or a vulnerability or malware that may exist out there in some way, right? Vulnerability is the vector by which the threat can be realized. So the latest exploit for OpenSSL as an example, or a vulnerability in Apache that can be used by the threat, the person that wants to use it. The exploit is the actual mechanism, so the vulnerability is the problem. The exploit is the, I won't say solution, but the exercising of that problem to accomplish further level access. And then the target of evaluation in an assessment is, what is it that I am assessing? What am I looking at? Am I looking at a control system? Am I looking at a relay? Am I looking at system operations? Am I looking at the utility as a whole? What is my target that I'm evaluating? So basic security concepts, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, standard security pyramid, right? The premise being that each corner of the pyramid represents effectively one aspect of the other. So as you move further away from confidentiality, you get higher availability. Further away from integrity, you get, et cetera, et cetera. So what is confidentiality? That's the protection of information. What is availability? That's the accessibility of the information. And what is integrity? That's the validity of the information. In other words, that it has not been tampered. When it comes to hackers, there's really 3 different sort of labels that hackers get. There's the black hats. Those are considered people that are out there to, either they don't care or they're out there to cause harm in some way, not playing by the rules. The white hats on the other side are typically the defenders of the systems, the security professionals, or the ones that are doing things for the good of society, not with the intent to do bad. So they are doing responsible disclosure, they're keeping things in the appropriate accords. And then there's this gray area sort of in between, which is maybe they are white hats and they're trying to do the right thing, but the company is saying, sorry, we're not going to fix that. Or in turn responds with a lawsuit against them for finding a vulnerability or whatever. And so they operate in this sort of nebulous zone. Sure, I'll actually talk about that in a bit. But responsible disclosure basically means if you find a problem in a system or whatever it may be, how do you go about communicating that to the entity who owns that system or the vendor who makes it? And so one sort of camp of that approach is to email security at that company or find who the security contact is for that company and say, hey, I found this vulnerability. Here's a proof of concept for it, or here's how I trigger that vulnerability, and work with them to work on remediation and a fix for it. Some companies are receptive to that, some are not. Other channels you can use are going to government agencies to report them. They work with the vendors. Another approach is based on your relationship already with somebody at that company or vendor or purchase agreement or license or whatever you may have with that entity and go through standard support channel. Non- or irresponsible disclosure. This affects the entire world. Let me just put that out there publicly to the hell with everyone that wants to do something, right? Let it happen as a free-for-all. They'll either fix it or not, and in the meantime, there's chaos. That's bad. So all sorts of categories of hackers. I talked a little bit about this in the type of people that are interested. But they also view this somewhat as a pyramid where you look at the capabilities and resources are increasing as you get more and more towards the nation states. That's generally true. Capabilities are a question mark. Capabilities don't necessarily increase. You can have capabilities down at the criminal level that far exceed what nation states are capable of because their motivation is different and the amount of time that they exercise it is greater. I'm more motivated to make money than I am to start a war, for instance, in most cases. Right. So all sorts of different terms that people use. Whackers and phreakers whackers are basically people who just find a vulnerability and just try to find systems to break them using that particular vulnerability. Phreakers it's a phone terminology, not really important for this. Crackers are people that make key generators and stuff like that for software, blah, 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 blah. So when you do an assessment, what types of things do you have to do, right? So one is you have to discover, when you're looking at a system, for instance, what are all of the components that are connected to it? I have to scan the network, right, and look at what's open in that. You could also, so you can do that with tools like Nmap as an example, or you can use insiders to provide information to you. Social engineering and convincing somebody to give you network diagrams, for instance, when they shouldn't be giving you network diagrams. Another activity is to actually take the step of penetrating the network, gain a foothold on that network, rather than being this passive third party scanning things or active third party scanning things, to actually get a foothold on the network, connect to their network and be a part of their network and then scan again, right, find more stuff in there. And some ways to do that is to leverage vulnerabilities, to exploit an actual thing that was found in terms of the external scanning. Next is to, in an ethical assessment, is you don't just break stuff and say, all right, see you later. In an ethical assessment, you typically recommend mitigations or state things that allowed you to get the foothold you got or to take advantage of the system that you did. You state how you did that, provide the methodology, and what they could have done to stop you from doing it. One sort of mantra of CEH is that observations have very little value if there are no mitigations. In other words, if you just say, well, we have this problem, and that's it. You leave it at that. Well, that's useful, but in an ethical assessment environment, you're not helping them just by pointing problems, right? I can point at problems all day long. But if they don't know how to fix it or don't know what the impact of it is, then, if I say, here, you have 1 million problems, and I'm not one of them, what's that help, right?
There's a commercial about that one. Security monitors.
So, I mean, identifying vulnerabilities is great. It does help a little bit, but they wouldn't be hiring you to identify these if they knew already how to fix them, right? So you have to think about it from that perspective. So in an assessment, what do? Well, first you prepare, right? In an ethical assessment, you have to have a scope. They will tell you what is in bounds and out of bounds, what is okay for you to do and not okay for you to do. And you do not step outside of that scope in an ethical assessment. Even if you're tempted to, oh, look, this little dangling fruit over here, that's really nice. I could easily do that. But it's out of scope. I'm not supposed to touch that system, or I'm not supposed to do something. You can note that that existed as part of the assessment, et cetera, but you cannot take the step to leverage or use that without requesting authorization to do so. Violation of a scope statement on a professional assessment is grounds for legal action. They can either sue you or criminal charges can be pressed. Okay. We'll talk about what the legal aspect is, right? So evaluation and conduct, so one is respect the system operators. In other words, the people that are running the system are your utmost concern. You're not there to cause havoc. You're not there to denial of service their system and make them, scramble, right? Unless that's in your scoping. You need to remember that you're there to help them, not to point out their faults or whatever it may be and say, you guys suck. Deal with them, right? You're there to support them, help them, and say, all right, now here are some things that you did wrong. Here's some things you can do to improve that. Another key point in industrial control systems is to understand the consequences of downtime. And by that I mean, if I'm going to connect to a system, and that is, let's say, the main EMS, and that's in scope for me to do, I don't turn it off. Because if I turn it off, there's no energy management system anymore, and bad things are going to happen, right? When you get to the conclusion, in essence, when you're done with the assessment, you need to clearly note and define and explain anything that you observed along the way. Things you leveraged, things you didn't leverage, things you tried to leverage but didn't work. All of that is useful to them to say, look, you're doing well in these areas and you're doing bad in these others. A lot of assessments purely point out the bad. And while those are helpful, it doesn't help them build a case internally to say, look, this money we've spent is good. All it is here's all the things we're not doing yet. And that's bad to sell to management, right? It's not like, oh, look, we stopped all these things, these 500, but we didn't stop this one. So it looks worse, right? And you need to suggest the mitigation. We've talked about that already. So from a legal approach, there's certain things that you need to do, right? You need to determine the needs. You need to get permission. You need to schedule the assessment. In other words, they will give you a window of time that you're authorized to do things. Don't do things outside of that window of time, unless they authorize you to do that, right? You need to actually perform the assessment. Go about the scoping that you said and figure out what it is that you do. You need to analyze the results that you get from that, figure out what you did, what you weren't able to do, et cetera, what the results came back from scans and information gathering, and collate that into something that's useful. You don't just provide them dumps of log files that say, here's everything I do, you sort through it, make sense of that, right? Although it's useful sometimes to provide those as data archives to validate your you need to create the report, and then you need to present the report. Notice I didn't say you email the report. That's another thing under CEH that is underscored very heavily, is that these reports are very, very sensitive in nature. You need to protect them, and you shouldn't be sending them in any way, shape, or form that's clear text, via accessible channels, et cetera. And you should always present the results in person the first time. If they request, the electronic copy of it or whatever, then you can provide that via USB stick or secure delivery in some way, shape, or form or whatever. But you should not be putting it out into the world to potentially cause further harm to that company by having this information out there. Legality. So I mentioned a bit about criminal charges. Well, one example is Department of Justice Title 18, which is basically the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which in this particular case, it's around protected computers in the financial context, but nonetheless, if you access something without authorization, or if you exceed the access you've been told you can have to the system, you are potentially in violation of Department of Justice Title 18, and that's a federal offense. So in an assessment, In an assessment, you start with passive and active reconnaissance. I scan, I gather information that's publicly available. I try to figure out the footprint of whatever it is that I'm looking at, right? I define my scope of okay, well, here is what not the scoping of the assessment, but the scoping of what I can do now. Here is what I see that's open. Here's the information I have. What can I do with it? You then do active scanning of the systems. I start scanning IP ranges, et cetera. So in the reconnaissance stage, I may do a who is query on the company, for instance, and look for valid IP ranges. Or I may look for derivations or holding companies of the company that have IP ranges. And those will define, let's say, the networks I can look at, unless I've been told specifically already in my scoping with the company. Here is a network I want you to assess. Right? But gather that information. Once I scan and see what's open and available, then I can refine the scope and say, well, you know, they have a web service available, so I can look at that and I can start doing things on that. I need to gain access via one of those vectors to gain access to the system. Pivot and go deeper. I need to determine mitigations for the access vector that I just did. So it's not, oh, let me keep going. It's like, right, well, here is what you could have done to stop this initial foothold, right? Then I need to be able to maintain access in some cases, and by that I mean I need to be able to keep that foothold I have and pivot deeper into the network. And then eventually I draft the report and then present the report and provide a final report after the feedback from the team about the presentation. Typically, those presentations are at like a CSO style level, but they almost always have their chief architect or somebody else in the room who will provide comments based on your report and say, well, yeah, that's true, but your assessment of the criticality of that component is wrong. It's not as critical to the operations because we have these 5 other things that you didn't know about. And sometimes that becomes a heated discussion. People take offense to when you tell them that they did things wrong, just generally speaking. So black box, white box, and gray box assessment are similar to the labels of the hackers. Black box says, I'm not going to tell you anything about this. I'm not going to play by any particular rules. I'm just going to give you something and you figure it out. White box is sort of the opposite of that. I'm going to give you full product specifications. I'm going to tell you anything and everything you want to know about it. I'm going to assist you in any way, shape, or form as if you are an internal person that's trusted, right? Gray box is somewhere in between. They'll tell you a little bit, but not everything. All sorts of entry vectors that can be used, remote networks, local networks, dial-up. There's still a lot of people that have modem access to stuff, especially in industrial control systems. Stolen equipment is another one. People end up life equipment or just walk into a substation and take things. Use that to then pull passwords or other things off that. Social engineering is one of the most common ways that people attack systems. They just convince somebody that they're not attacking the system, right? Hi, I'm here from such and such a company. I've been contracted to help you guys with an evaluation or with working on something, fixing this particular problem. I need access to the facility. Or I need, you know, this password or whatever. And if you know the hierarchy of people from your prior research, you can say, you know, I'm working under John Doe, who's a manager in the information technology office out of, I don't know, Georgia. And so he's contracted me to come here and observe the behavior of how you guys are responding to that. I'm sounding more and more convincing by providing more additional information, right? And the last is sort of physical entry. Just break in. Sometimes that's a joke, right? I'm not trying to convince somebody, you just literally take a lock and go through, or find an unlocked door and go through that, whatever it may be. That's often out of scope, but a lot of times companies will allow you to go into that. Reports should have results of the activities, the tasks you performed, everything that was successful, everything that you discovered, even if you don't have mitigations for it or didn't leverage it, and then mitigations for anything that you identified. So there, I'm wrapping up. There's supposed to be questions, so I put a discussion point there, which is what really makes assessing these control systems different? Why are they different than any other IT system out there? A lot of what I talked about applies to general IT systems too. But what really is different about these control systems? That's open online too, by the way.
there isn't one extensive for refinement widespread. It's the power we have been, looking at the control for the cooling and HVAC and so on for the blue water.
Yep.
Very unique system. Lots of redundancy and significant monitoring.
Yep.
So I think to me, the difference is that these control algorithms really play a major relationship with how you send data in and out of your computing system.
Yeah.
Because one manages the other.
Yep. So one key difference, and I'll throw this out there since we're out of time basically, that's based on what Ravi is saying, is that there is both a cyber and a physical manifestation of this, and they can work and operate off each other. I can use physical information to my advantage for a cyber attack in industrial control systems, and I can use the fragility of the physical process as part of my cyber attack, right? If I can interrupt the physical process, that's bad. The other big thing is that these systems can be very fragile in some cases. If I just cause a delay in an operation happening, that could have consequences. It won't necessarily have consequences, but it could. In a normal internet scale system, if I can cause a minor delay in a system in one request or a handful of requests, no big deal. But if you look at, say, Google, if I can interrupt Google's operation for 1 second or 2 seconds, how many millions of dollars do they potentially lose in that 1 to 2 seconds? It can be a lot, right, in ad revenue and impressions and other things. But it'll recover, right? That's what their architectures are. The industrial control system may or may not recover what can cause an impact. So that's just one key. And I'm out of time. So think about it. I'm always available for discussion.
Robin, are you ready to go?
Yep, I'm ready.
Share your screen.
Yeah, let me give myself the presenter one. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Great. All right, so my name is Robin Gauthier. I'm a research scientist at the University of Illinois 1 day a week, and then the rest of the time I lead the network perception startup, which is the company that develops and commercializes the NPView application, which is an application that started as a research project under the name of APT and then NetAPT some years ago. So the goal of this presentation today is to give everyone a bit of history and an overview of what this tool can do and what are the next steps. So it all started a decade ago, actually, with a student, Senkal Singh, who worked with Professor David Nichol and Professor Bill Sanders on his thesis project to try to automate the verification of safety policies implemented in firewalls. Then the project was funded by the TCG Center, and after Senkal graduated, received a grant from the Department of Homeland Security for tech transfer, which means that the grant aimed at moving the project from a research product in the lab into a commercial product to have even more impact in the industry. And at that time, I joined the project, and we co-founded the network perception business with my colleagues Muna Bemba, Edmund Rogers, Professor David Nichol, and Professor Bill Sanders. and we moved to the UIUC Research Park incubator called Enterprise Works 2 years ago. When Senka started the project, it was called APT, for Access Policy Tool. But then a few years later, the acronym APT became known for Advanced Persistent Threat. So we kind of had to move away from that name. So it got renamed to NetAPT. And then after the tech transfer and became commercialized, it got renamed into NPView. And so now that's the current name. So the goal, the motivation behind the first APT project was really to respond to a trend in the industry, which was to increase the connectivity with the process control systems, process control networks. So decades ago, those analog systems were kind of disconnected and isolated from each other. And with the advance of communication technologies, they became increasingly connected to the corporate network and even sometimes to the internet. So the devices in charge of making sure that no harmful connection can go from unsecure zone into the very secure process control network zones are called firewalls. And those firewalls are configured to try to implement a security policy to make sure that the risks are limited in terms of intrusions. To give you an example of a policy, for this high-level view of an utility network, we could have rules such as all the outbound traffic should end in DMZ, or also called like demilitarized zones. And so we create DMZs between all those different zones, and the firewalls are configured that in a way that all this outbound traffic should end there, and using jumping stations to go to the next zone. That way you limit the direct connection between unsecured to secure zones. So the industry, in the electric industry world, these trends also are concerned some key stakeholder in terms of how to prevent that added connectivity from increasing the risk to the larger infrastructure. And so regulations were created, and those are called the NERC SIP standards. SIP stands for Critical Infrastructure Protection, and NERC stands for the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. So NERC is kind of the industry branch of this regulation consortium. And then on the government side, they have another thing called FERC. And so FERC approves the standards that the NERC is drafting with the help of the industry. And FERC is also providing to NERC the authority to issue penalties and fines in case those standards are not respected. So the way it works today is that in the US, the country is divided into 8 NERC regions, and in each of those regions, utilities are being audited every few years by NERC auditors. And so those NERC auditors are reviewing config files from network devices, from firewalls, from routers. They're reviewing logs. They're asking questions to the utility engineers to make sure that all the standards are respected and that the utility is doing a good job in terms of protecting those critical networks from intrusions or from harmful connection. When a rule violation is discovered, fines can become pretty expensive. So what you see here on this slide is an example of a fine that was issued a few years ago, where a utility was received a penalty of $750,000 because they failed to identify some critical assets in the network. And those fines can go up to $1 million per day of violation, which means that if you have a violation discovered 30 days ago, then you can multiply 30 by 1 million a day, and that will give you the whole fine amount. So as you can imagine, utilities are very motivated to try to make sure that they comply with those regulations and try to make sure that they also are secure in terms of cyber intrusions. The problem is that those firewalls are configured using a set of rules and parameters that are stored in config files. And those files can be pretty complex and long to review. These slides just show you an example of a very small Cisco ASA config files in which the firewall has a definition for each of the network interfaces. So we have 3 of them defined on the left. Then definition of object groups, which are groups of IP addresses or groups of services. And then definitions of access rules, which are the rules that are allowing or denying traffic between interfaces and across networks. So if you imagine a utility network with 5 or 6 firewalls, and each of those firewalls have a config file like this, where they can reach thousands of lines with thousands of different access control lists, it can be very daunting for both the entities and auditors to try to make sense of all those rules and try to make sure that the network is well protected. If we look a bit more into the way a firewall is handling traffic, the key element is called the access control list, ACL. An ACL is a group of rules, and each rule will have a description of network traffic, often using the protocol, the source, and the destination information of that traffic, and then an action, either to accept the traffic or to deny, which means to block it, or to drop it, which means to block it and also to send an error message. And those rules are being treated by the firewall in a sequential order, which means that whenever a new network packet is received on one of the interfaces of the firewall will go through that table of rules and then try to match this new incoming packet with one of the traffic description. And if one match is detected, then the action from that match will be taken, and all the rules below that will be ignored for that specific packet. So it's important to understand that this ordering is critical, because if you add any permit at the top of your table, then you kind of compromise the rest of the rules inside your firewall. So not only you have the complexity of being able to make sense of each rule individually, but now you also have the complexity of taking into account the order of those rules and keeping like a mental model of which rule became first and how they are affecting the traffic when being received by the interface. And this problem becomes even more complex when you imagine that the policy can be distributed across multiple firewalls. So in a large utility, you can have hundreds of firewalls and routers. And so a given comprehensive safety policy can be spread across tens of those devices to make sure that the critical zones are protected. So the conclusion of that is that it's kind of impossible for human beings to do it manually. So that's where a tool like NPView came into place, where we can use algorithms and software to automatically read those tables, parse those config files, and make sense of it and show the results visually to humans to make their job easier. So NPView, the former NetAPT, is a desktop application. It runs on all major OSs, on Windows, Mac, and Linux. It's designed to be pretty lightweight, so it's just a simple desktop app. It works offline, which means it doesn't connect to anything in the network. To run it, you simply select config files from network devices, so either from firewalls, routers, or switches. I have an example of 6 files on the left here. You put them into the tool, and the tool will go through a process that has 3 major steps. The first step is to parse each of the files. So the commands, the statements inside each of the config files will be understood, and the model will be built out of it. Then the second step will be to infer the topology of the network, which means that the way devices, hosts, and gateways are connected with each other will be understood based on the relationship across IP addresses with the net mask and subnets. And then the third step will be to run what we call a path analysis, which is a way to compute the connectivity from every IP address in the network to every other IP address in the network. And that way we can see if the rules that I mentioned at the beginning, like the, ending all the outbound connection in the DMZs, for example, are respected by that network, and if there is no rule in the firewalls that are compromising that policy or opening gaps or adding risk to the network critical zones. And then the tool provides a way to export that data. So the tool is very visual. It tries to show a map, interactive map of the network, and then provides key feature for users to export the results of the topology inference and the path analysis into actionable reports. So we have product reports, we have a rule table, a path analysis table, and then different ways to export the map. All right, so I have a few screenshots to show the tool, but let me switch to the tool itself and show you a demo instead. That may be easier to understand. All right, I hope you can still see my screen. Let me import the set of 6 Cisco ASA firewalls that I mentioned earlier. So when you select the files and put them into the tool, the parsing process, so this first box on my previous slide will get started. Each of the lines in the config will be parsed, and then the topology will be inferred. And that topology is this interactive map where you can see our 6 firewalls in orange, connected by networks, those little blue clouds. And then each network will host potential gateways or other network assets or workstations or servers. And for each of those, I can always double click on them, see their host name, their IP addresses, add a label, add a color, and understand how they connect to the rest of the network. So first value for NPView users is to get that visual view of the visual map of their network and to understand how things are connected to each other. Users can automatically group the different zones that the firewalls are protecting, so that you can see where the remote access, internet access, corporate office, the SCADA network, the EMS, the energy management system, or the backup EMS are located in the network. And that zoning will help us when we do a path analysis to understand if there are paths that are violating the policy. In addition to parsing and doing this topo inference, the tool also will create a bunch of risk alerts to highlight potential misconfigurations or problems with the config files. So for example, if you have rules that are allowing traffic from any source towards any destination or just any services, then those risk alerts will flag those rules. And that way you can, when you do a rule audit job, you can review which rules can be risky and understand the impact of that risk and understand if you should revise the rule or if it's safe to keep it in the config like that. The rule audit table allows to do that. So it's a flat table of all the rules that were extracted from the devices. And if I go back to one of the devices to show you the native rule set, this is the native config file that was understood by the tool and then translated into that table. So for a user, it's easier to deal with that kind of Excel spreadsheet format on the left rather than having to understand the programmatic language of a raw config file on the right. And then users can review each rule one by one and approve them. So if there is no problem with the rule, they can just go through the list, add the justification, and audit them. Or if there is a problem, they can even flag the rules to review or to revise. All right, so this showed you the parsing stage and then the topology inference stage and the beginning of the audit stage. Now the third stage is the path analysis. So if I go to the path analysis tab and I start a full analysis, I will ask the model that the tool built in memory of the different firewalls connected to each other for the entire set of connections that this network allows. And what that means is that every time a firewall was imported into the tool knows how, depending on the vendor and the version of the firewall, they will handle this table of rules, and they will handle the order in which the rules are being presented. And based on that model understanding, then a simulation can be run to trace IP to IP connectivity across the entire network. And that's what this feature just provided. So when I send the request, the model ran the simulation, returned 1,641 individual paths. The map got highlighted to show me the source and the destinations of those paths. So destinations are in red, sources are in blue, and then hosts that are both source and destination will be colored with the two colors. On the left, I have the table that lists all the 1,641 paths, and I can click on any of those to highlight the path in the map. So that shows that this path goes from this outside network, crosses this corporate office firewall. It goes inside through an interface called outside, is allowed by a rule that allows traffic from 172.30 towards any. Then it's allowed through a route, and then it goes out through an interface called marketing, and then reaches that final destination, the network, the host in red. So now that I have this feature, I can easily check what I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, which was the high-level policy rules that govern my network and that protect my critical infrastructure. So, for example, if I have my primary EMS zone over there, I know that those are the most important assets. I can right-click on any of them and say, okay, show me the paths that are reaching this host. We see that we have result of 6 paths being returned. One of them is coming from a neighboring network, and it's the EMS database. Another one is coming from the corporate network zone. And then a third one is coming from a remote wide area network EMS host. So those two may be okay, but that last one, which is crossing 3 different firewalls before reaching that EMS zone, may not be a good one. Like that, I may not want someone from the remote access zone to be able to get access all the way towards my most critical asset in the energy management system. So if I do that, I can just find this path in my table, and then okay, that's a high-risk path, and now I can return that to my team, and then they can fix that path if needed. So to be able to get to that type of insight where you discover paths that are crossing multiple firewalls, multiple zones, requires this kind of software algorithmic understanding of each of the firewall rules to be able to be revealed visually to end users, and it's kind of difficult to do if you just have manual review of those config files. In addition to the direct connectivity, we can combine paths together by displaying what we call a stepping stone attack map. So if I select the same target and I say show stepping stone as a exposure map, another type of highlight will be revealed where this time in red I have hosts that can directly connect to this target. In orange will be host and network that could connect through a red jumping station, and then yellow would be the one that are 2 jumping stations away, like 2 stepping stones away. So these type of highlight reveal, like if I'm an attacker and I were to compromise this yellow host, I would have to first compromise the orange one and then the red one before being able to reach that target. So here we see the start of the buildup of what we call an attack graph, where we can combine paths together to understand how a security policy could lead to different levels of difficulties in terms of breaching zones and getting access to the most critical assets in the network. All right, let me go back to the slides. Root audit, path analysis, and then stepping stone, the thing that I just showed. So the tool, as I said at the beginning, so the tool is now commercialized by Network Perception. It's been there for 2 years. We still have research activity, R&D activity going on inside the company. Among the main work on which we're working now is the adding support for layer 2 connectivity, so being able to understand how switches and VLANs are augmenting or diminishing connectivity in the map I was showing. Also adding support for layer 7, so application layer firewalls such as Palo Alto firewalls. We're working on being able to do change tracking of full sets over time. So if one is using NPView to audit a network today, and then a month later you want to see what changed in the network, then you can import a new version of your config files, and then the tool will reveal some kind of a diff view of the topology to show what host or what network were added, removed, and also what paths were added and removed based on the recent changes. And lastly, we're working on being able to import additional network data into the map. So far we've been focusing on config files from firewalls and routers and switches, but we also want to be able to import network scan results from tools such as Nmap, where if you have a scanning campaign and a scan report with vulnerability information, to be able to import that report into NPView and augment the map with the host being discovered, as well as being able to import network traces from sniffers such as Wireshark or TCP-dump, where you can extract the host that are communicating through the trace, augment the map inside NPView, and also validate the path analysis that NPView simulation engine provided with the actual paths that were recorded on the wire by your sniffing tool.
Robin, you have 5 minutes remaining.
All right, and I think I'm actually done. This is the list of publications and patents around that technology, if you want to learn more, and I'll be happy to answer any question.
Anyone have any questions?
I'll just toss a comment out there, which is for any of the CREDC related researchers, we do have a installation of network perception for the test bed here at Illinois. If it's of use to your research, you can leverage it there, and Robin would be more than happy, I'm sure, to assist in determining how it can apply to your research if it's of interest.
Completely. Yep. Great point.
So I think if you recall last week that Salman Zanuz presented the CIPSA work, and a component of that uses some version of this tool, correct, Robin?
That's right.
Okay. So it is useful as a production thing, that utilities are using it to help them with audits, but it is also useful for research purposes.
Right.
So Sherry, we could wrap up. Let's thank the speaker.